Thanks very much for coming this afternoon. I'm really excited to share with you some of the results from the Ignite work that we've been doing over the last year and a half. What I want to do first is to disclose that I don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose relevant to this presentation, but I also want to disclose that I'll likely raise more questions that I'll have answers for you as we go through. As Sue indicated, I want to start with talking a little bit about the moral underpinnings of why we would consider returning research results to participants, to talk a little bit about what the current Canadian regulatory environment says about the return of research results, and then I want to go into two studies that we've done through Ignite and to look at first what researchers think about the return of research results, and the second about what parents and participants who are old enough to describe their feelings also feel. The offer of a return of a summary of research results really wasn't on researchers' radars until about 10 to 15 years ago. People did the research, they published it, but they really didn't think too much about returning even a summary of results back to participants. Over the last decade or so, it's become increasingly recognized that this is a moral obligation of researchers, and most research ethics boards within North America, both in Canada and the US, require us as researchers to offer a summary back in a lay format, not just as a publication. With the explosion of the genomics technologies that we've all heard about over the course of these last lunchtime seminar series this year, we know that individual results are now coming to the fore. And it is increasingly recommended, although not encoded yet in many countries, that we should be considering offering individual results back. And typically this is tied to three elements. First, that the information has adequate clinical utility, and important clinical utility for the individuals, that there's adequate analytic validity, and that it's actionable. And I'll talk about all these as we go through. First, to talk a little bit about the moral underpinnings. This is really based in a principle of respect for persons. We know that we should not use individuals, as a means to an end, so as a means to our research. And I think David Shalowitz in JAMA really said this very nicely, and I'll quote what he said, which was, "It is disrespectful to treat research volunteers as conduits for generating scientific data without giving due consideration to their interests in receiving information about themselves derived from research participation." And in this quote, he was talking about both a summary of research results, which may have relevance to individuals, as well as that individual information that may come from the research. There are a number of benefits that can be accrued to individuals, and I've grouped these under direct benefits, which would include emphasizing the central role of the participant in the research. There has been a public perception of exploitation of individuals, and by sharing information with research participation that may diminish that sense of exploitation. And then clearly it may provide medically and psychologically important information, both immediately for individuals as well as in the future. There's also a principle of distributive justice that needs to be considered for this, in that we all know that some individuals are going to be much more able and apt to ask us about return of results, but this is really unfair to individuals who don't have that capacity. And so by having a broad requirement of researchers to have plans and processes in place to offer research results in a uniform way addresses this distributive justice question. We also know from a social justice standpoint that we have a responsibility to be responsive to those who are vulnerable. And in particular, my role as a pediatric oncologist, that applies to children, but it also applies in other worlds, and that would include, for example, a research participant relationship where there is a hierarchy where the researcher is typically the more powerful in the group. And there may also be social disparities based on social and economic capacity, as well as international things to think about. However, there has been well recognized, as we've talked about a return of research results, that there are potential harms and barriers in considering it that need to be both considered and addressed as we develop processes for the return of results. And I've broken these into three broad categories. And the first that lots of people are concerned about is the logistics. This is no question a burden on researchers. You have to maintain contact with the individuals. You have to have a process for disseminating these results. And this, no question, costs both time and money. There's been, in particular for the return of individual research results in a genetic context, lots of concern that we don't have adequate numbers of genetic counselors to be able to address the huge numbers that we may encounter in current technologies. There may be harms to participants as individuals. We know that research results are not the same as results that are obtained in a clinical setting. There may be misidentification of samples. There's not the same kind of quality assurance that happens in a research lab that is required in a clinical lab. There may be broader impacts on relatives, not just the individual in front of you. And so all of those things need to be considered in whether or not one will return research results to a participant. There has also been some writing about concern about discrimination subsequently for participants based on some of the genetic findings that come out of genetic research. And so one can imagine that this may have impact upon insurance and ability to work. For example, if you're a pilot and you have a type of eye degeneration that will happen over time, perhaps you won't get that position. In the US, there is law that prevents discrimination based on genetics, but that doesn't exist in Canada at this point. And then thirdly, as a broad group, there is harm to researchers and research. There may be legal liability, both in providing information to an individual that is assumed to be definitive and complete. And so, for example, you can imagine that a participant has taken part, they've received information back, they say you don't have a breast cancer risk gene, but then 5 years later there's a new one discovered. When does the responsibility of the researcher end in terms of providing information from that original sample back to the individual? And does that create legal liability for them in the long term? Because of the costs that I've mentioned under the logistics side of things, there is opportunity costs that may go with this, that we lose some portion of the operating grant that would be otherwise devoted to the scientific agenda, that would be therefore devoted to returning the research results. Now, from an ethical standpoint, I don't mind that. I think that if we think about informed consent costs money to develop the consent forms, to have time for individuals to get that consent, to go through research ethics board. None of us consider that to be inappropriate use of funds of an operating grant. I think from an ethical standpoint, there's a very good argument that we should be returning research results to both in summary form and individuals, and I believe that that really should be a cost of the operating grant that funders seriously consider. And then lastly, under the category of harms to researchers and research, or barriers at least, there is certainly the competence to interpret some of the results that we get from a clinical standpoint. That many researchers are not clinicians, and even if they are clinicians, they don't have the knowledge and ability to confer the information that's needed around genetic counseling. From a Canadian regulatory standpoint, the Tri-Council document is what governs all human research essentially in Canada. Any institution that receives any funding from the Tri-Council is obligated to follow the Tri-Council policy, and that includes even if that particular research project is not directly funded by one of the three main agencies. So if the institution receives funding from that, then any research conducted under that institution must follow the Tri-Council. And essentially that means all academic institutions within Canada follow this. The Tri-Council policy is divided into a number of different chapters, and the third chapter talks about consent, and in that it has an article that states researchers have an obligation to disclose incidental findings that have been interpreted as having significant welfare implications, either medical, psychosocial, or social. The Tri-Council policy also later in a chapter dedicated to genetic research talks about the return of genomic results, but does not make it does not define a specific process associated with it. And in that chapter, it actually recommends rather than requires. So there is some discrepancy even within the Tri-Council policy document itself. And in neither section does it provide us information of what the threshold should be. And that's one of the things that has been a really significant barrier for moving this field forward until just recently, that people have talked about something that's clinically useful, something that has serious impact. But up until March of this year, there was no definition of what that might be. These types of recommendations are echoed in many different international organizations now in Europe and from working groups. For example, the National Heart and Lung Blood Institute in the US has recommendations, and they very much parallel these, which also say they need to be clinically useful, analytically valid, and actionable. From a pediatric perspective, there is no specific guidance on how to treat children differently within the Tri-Council policy document. There is an accompanying document called Best Practices for Health Research Involving Children and Adolescents, but this is not a regulatory requirement. In this document, they do recommend similar treatment to children as they would for adults, in that if there are significant health implications discovered in incidental findings, they should be provided back to the child. And in fact, they go further and say that parents, as responsible for their children, must receive individual results if they are actionable and they have significant health benefits, just like we would ask child protection to step in if a parent wasn't taking information and using it for the best interests of the child. Now, that's not been overall accepted, but that is a statement that's in this document. In March of this year, the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics published guidelines, and this was led by Robert Green. This now, I have to emphasize, is from a perspective of clinical testing. But their recommendation, as written here, is that constitutional mutations found in the genes on the minimum list, and this minimum list refers to 56 current mutations in a number of different conditions, should be reported by the laboratory regardless of the indication for which the clinical sequencing was ordered. So if a sequencing is ordered on a sample and you discover one of these mutations in one of the genes, then you're obligated to return that back to the physician who ordered the test. And they argue that the analogy is as if you were doing a chest x-ray or an MRI of the head. Even though you may have been looking, for example, say for pneumonia on the chest x-ray, if you discover a lung cancer or a lesion suspicious of lung cancer, as a radiologist, you are going to report that. You're not going to ignore it. They apply in their argument the same thing, that for genes that are discovered when you're doing clinical gene testing that may have clinical relevance to the individual, that they should be provided. They provide a long list, but essentially they group into these 4 categories that are on the bottom of the slide. These are all cancer predisposition syndromes, for example, Li-Fraumeni syndrome, cardiomyopathy syndromes, cardiac arrhythmia syndromes, and an individual gene for malignant hypothermia. These are not the entire genes, but very specific mutations within them that confer a high risk of developing the condition, for which there is some action available, either surveillance or treatment or avoidance, for example, of the anesthetic agent that might cause malignant hypothermia. As you can imagine, this has led to quite a firestorm of discussion in the literature around whether this should be applied. But it is also an opportunity for us to look at it as the first threshold that has been set for what might be shared from the research context, and I'll talk a bit about that a bit more later. So there are many questions that arise when we think about the return of incidental findings in a research context. First, from a clinical standpoint, I've just shown you that there's increasing comment from the clinical sphere that we should be returning some results. The question that has often been risen is, do we have an obligation as genomic researchers to look for and to report either genetic individual results of the target condition, so the one you happen to be studying, or incidental findings that are completely unrelated that you've come across? Is there a particular threshold that we can use? Can we learn from the clinical recommendations of the Green paper? If there is an obligation, how long does that obligation continue? Do participants actually want results? And what if the results have negative implications for them? Do they still want them? What are our obligations to not only that participant, but to their SIBs? If you discover a breast cancer gene in an individual, do I need to tell the sibling of that individual? Does the person need to tell it? What if the person has died? They had a cancer gene, they've now died. Do we have obligations to go back to that family? If we do, who do we have an obligation to go back to? And then an opportunity we had in the first study was to look at what current institutional practices across Canada, and I'll show you a couple of slides related to that. So an opportunity came a few years ago to study these questions, and there was a request for applications both from Genome Canada and CIHR in 2 big categories. And in both those categories, I had the opportunity to put in a couple of JELS questions. And these included looking at parent and participants, as well as research attitudes in the development of guidelines, as well as to develop specific guidelines. And I'm really going to just talk about the top one in terms of our findings. Out of that request for applications, we got not one, but two, but three of them funded. And so it gave us really a terrific opportunity to look at this question from a number of different aspects. The first one I'll mention is the Canadian Pediatric Cancer Genomics Consortium, short form CPCGC. And this was looking at somatic cancer mutations in very poor prognosis pediatric cancers and led by Paul Sorensen out of Vancouver. The finding of rare genes in Canada, the FORGE consortium was led by Kim Boycott in Ottawa, and it was looking really at rare disease gene discovery. And then, as Sue mentioned at the very beginning, as you've heard here over the course of the year, the IGNITE project, which is here at Dalhousie, is not only looking at rare disease gene discovery, but also therapeutic target identification and drug discovery. So we took advantage of having these three consortiums up and running all at the same time and developed a questionnaire to look at researchers' attitudes towards the return of research results. And the first part of this was the validation of that questionnaire by the IGNITE team members. So you'll see that they're not subjects of the questionnaire, but they had a great deal of input into the construction of the questionnaire. We enlisted 107 researchers, we sent the questionnaire to 107 researchers in CPCGC and in FORGE back in March to May of 2012. And the respondents had a wide range of experience. Some of them were medical geneticists, some of them were genomic researchers, some of them were lab scientists. As I say, half of them medical genetics and 20% non-clinical. I would say that, just to note that this came out before the publication of the ACMG clinical recommendations. So we did ask about thresholds and so on, but this was without the benefit of having that paper out there. And these results have been published in full in Genetics and Medicine back in January. So I'm just going to show you a few highlights from this. One of the first questions we asked is, what right do you feel a participant has to get analytically validated results of genetic research? And we broke it down into two subsections. The first subsection is related to the condition under study. So if you're, for example, looking at a neurological condition, then in almost all circumstances, there was the feeling that the participant should have the research results. And that sort of makes intuitive sense. You've recruited the participant to take part in this research, to look at, can we figure out what's going on for your child or for yourself? But then under incidental findings, they weren't as strong, but if you look at it, the majority of time, 68%, the researchers feel that participants have really a strong right to receive incidental findings of genetic research. These next two slides, the color's a bit different from here, but we asked first whether genomic researchers have a responsibility to look at their data to see if they can discover some of these findings. And so this does link a little bit to the green paper in terms of how far do you need to go with it. And you'll see that most felt they didn't have a really strong responsibility to look systematically at their genomic data that they've collected. But in the next slide, you'll see that if they come across it, do they have a responsibility to communicate these findings? Yes. So if you happen to come to it, that it is on some list that hasn't been defined yet, then researchers feel that they have a personal responsibility, and this is across Canada, with respect to returning research results to individuals. And I would say that that also, again, makes intuitive sense, that if we discover something that is actionable, that we can prevent harm for, it is very hard to then just slide that into the desk and not talk to participants about it. We asked in this question for what length of time researchers should be responsible for the return of individual results. And this really got at the question that I raised earlier on was, is this an indefinite responsibility? Do we have to keep looking at the results over time? And most researchers felt not. So that if you look at the various options, you could have length of project period, length of access to the database, until manuscript publication. That really fits with the study finish. And most of them fell in that category. There were a few that felt that this should be an indefinite responsibility. And we weren't able to look at this specifically, but my feeling is that these would be some of the medical geneticists who would have had an ongoing responsibility and interaction with the patient over time. We also tried to get at the question of what is the threshold that we should be using in terms of returning research results. And we've broken it down into a number of different categories. So One is there a specified absolute risk? So that if half of the time you're going to run into significant difficulties, is that an example of when we should return research results? And what I'll just point out as I go through each of this is that there was none that fit into a majority that every time you should do it. So that it is one of the difficulties that we encounter is that researchers don't have a uniform way to approach this. So an option was specified absolute minimal risk. The second option was a relative minimal risk, so it's 3 times the general population. Is that a threshold that we should use? Should we use a threshold that confers a high degree of severity? Surprisingly, to me, only 40% indicated that should be our threshold. Should it come from a predetermined list? A number wrote in by hand saying it should really be what was discussed in the consent at the very beginning. And that just underlines that we, I think, has a responsibility as researchers to try to define as best we can what might be encountered and whether we're going to provide it. And then again, if the condition is actionable. There were very few who said incidental findings should not be offered, consistent with what we saw before. A different question was, well, if we have a responsibility to the participant, what rights does a sibling have to receive the results of genetic research? And we asked it again in 2 sections. One is if this was an incidental finding for which there was no effective preventative treatment or surveillance or anything that you could do about it. And despite there being no effective treatment, about 60% thought the participant should still, the sibling should still have an opportunity to learn about significant, serious genetic results. If there's effective treatment, that increased to almost 80%. Another issue that I raised earlier on was what responsibilities do we have if the subject is dead? So, for example, in a cancer trial where you've had the information, the subject has died, we have no way to go back to them without specific instructions about what to do. The vast majority thought we should be offering these results to the parents if it's a child, or to next of kin if an adult, or to brothers and sisters if they're old enough to receive the results. Very few would say that it should be only published in the medical literature and then allow people to seek out that information for themselves. I'm just going to turn for a moment to policy and practice. So the Tri-Council guidelines have been revised, and they were set now about 1.5 years ago. This questionnaire was done around that same time. And we asked, first, is this a real problem? Have you ever encountered incidental findings when you're doing your genomic research? And first, the 58% say that they found some clinically relevant genetic findings, so that the research is successful in many times in identifying a novel gene. And 23% of the respondents said that they had discovered incidental findings to what their target was. And a number of them replied that that had happened more than once for them in the course of their research. We then asked them, does your local research ethics board require researchers to offer individual genetic research results to participants? And as you'll see, about 20% said never, 36% said sometimes, and quite a few did not know what the requirements were for their R&D in regards to this. And then even if there was a process recommended, even if it was recommended, did the R&D actually have a process for the researchers to follow? And again, you'll see that only 1/4 of them had some kind of very specific process that researchers would follow. So mostly researchers are in the dark as to what they should be doing and how to do it. So a summary from this component of the research, looking at the researchers' points of view, was that in general, researchers support the offer of both targeted and incidental research finding, if encountered, and that's not just to the participant, but more broadly to parents and kin of a child or those of deceased individuals, if these have serious implications, and to siblings, whether or not those findings are specifically actionable. The duration of responsibility, most of them feel that it should be tied very much to the project length, which makes sense in terms of their ongoing ability to intervene. And I didn't show you this slide, but most researchers felt that genetic counseling was very important, in particular prior to providing incidental findings back to the individuals. But many also indicated that should occur even before they participated in the research because of the potential implications. They do report a very significant lack of guidance, so a lack of what should be offered, how to confirm these results, factors to be used to determine offers. I showed you on that. It's all over the place in terms of whether it's related to a particular threshold, severity, relative risk. None of those things were one that stood out for researchers in terms of returning results. So the conclusions that we had from this is that there needs to be greater policy specificity. The existing Tri-Council policy as it stands, while it says that we should have an obligation to return individual results that have clinical severity, it does not go far enough to give us specific definitions of when that threshold has been met. I will just say that I have been in touch with the PRE, which is the, forgot the name for it now. So it's the group that guides the evolution of the Tri-Council policy, and they recognize this discrepancy that I've described between this first article in Chapter 3 and the genetics chapters, and there will be a public consultation in the fall in terms of input about how we make these definitions for thresholds and unifying the TCPS across these two chapters. So I want to turn for the last 15 minutes or so to talk about what participants think about the return of genomic research results. In this particular study, we took advantage, again, of the collaborations between CPCGC, the Cancer Consortium, the FORGE Consortium, and Ignite here. And in this case, we had participants from all three consortia being contacted. And this, as you see, comes right across Canada. We sent out a total of 563 questionnaires and had response of 64%. So really, we were very happy at the response rate of that much. And we do plan for both the FORGE and the CPCG funding finishes in the next few months, but Ignite continues on. And so we have asked Ignite participants whether or not they'd be willing to have a follow-up questionnaire. And we've had a very good response rate from the Ignite participants saying that they would be happy to participate in that. So we plan to do that again in about a year's time, both to look at whether or not their opinions are stable over time, but also if they've had an intervention of returning research results, how that has happened for them, what the impact has been. So this slide just shows some of the demographics, and often you'll see in questionnaires that there's predominance of older individuals, is what we see. This reflection of ethnicity is actually probably pretty representative of what we would see across Canada. They're primarily an educated group and primarily relatively well off in terms of income. So again, we asked some of the similar questions that we asked the researchers. So do you feel you have a right? And so as you remember, the researchers, most of them felt that they did, and you'll see very strong opinions of a right to the research results. In the blue here is whether it's related to the core condition under study, and the red is incidental findings unrelated to the core condition. So that's perhaps anticipated that participants would want these. We also asked, because one of the things that people have said is that, well, do you really want research results that have negative implications? Either negative implications for your child or negative implications for yourself. And so this question asked, I would want incidental results of genetic research that would show a serious health impact for my child, for which in the blue there's prevention or treatment, and in the red for which there is no prevention or treatment. And so you'll see the majority will want it if there's something that they can do about it. It's still the majority, but less strong. And so it does speak to the fact that it is important to talk about the potential implications of this information with participants as we get consent both to participate in the research as well as when we're providing research results back. Very few said definitely not. We also asked participants who were old enough, so these were primarily parents and adults, what if there were unexpected results, so these incidental findings again, that had a personal impact, not just on my child, but on me. And you'll see again, the majority of individuals, for when there's prevention or treatment, they want to know these results, whether they're the target of the condition or incidental. And there's been a good argument from Paul Minette at the Health Canada, who says the name for incidental is really not right, because it's not incidental to that individual. That is really profound impact on them. And so unexpected is probably a better way to term this. The literature says incidental, but unexpected is something, because it's not so incidental to you if you have it. We also wanted to get at this concern that, you know, if we're doing these genome-wide sequencing, we're going to have perhaps many, many findings. And do parents and individuals, can they really take all that information in? Do they want all that information? And you know, this is a response to this question, and maybe in reality this is different, but this is what they say, and this is that they want all the relevant findings. We try to quantify it. Is it only to the condition under study? Is it 1 or 2 findings? Is it up to 10 findings? And you'll see that nobody wants just 10. They want them all, and whether it's 5 or 10 or 100. Now, what the implications of really doing that is, that's a different matter, but on paper, that's what they would like. We also know that we're going to encounter research results that are occasionally uncertain, and in terms of implications, clinical implications, that they're relatively new findings, they're not correlated with outcome yet. And so we asked participants what they thought should be done with this. And the first question was, well, the researcher should decide. They'll look at it, they'll make the decision independent of the participant. Very few wanted that to happen. Most wanted some say, that there'll be some engagement with the participant. Now, this was a questionnaire, so we didn't ask what kind of engagement. Is this a public consultation? Is this representative individuals? We did ask it indirectly to say, if there, as an independent committee, constituted of both scientists and of participants, is this a sufficient way to address this? Because we do want to figure out what kind of threshold of genetic conditions we should provide, and you'll see very few wanted somebody else deciding for them. Most people wanted to be involved in the final decision, even for uncertain information. One of the questions we also wanted to ask was, the logistics is considered a really big barrier for researchers, and are there different ways that we can provide research results? So this is just one thing that we asked, and this is, if you had a confidential website, and this would require tools that will allow individuals to both understand the information that was there, as well as to have access to what this has implications for them, and then subsequent access to clinical care, both in genetics counselors or clinicians, but access to a site for my own results and for their child's results, the majority would take it. Now, the number would not, and this is more likely to access this information if they have high income, high education, and comfort with the use of the internet, all things that you might expect in terms of the ability to access this kind of site. We also asked participants in what they thought about sharing with brothers and sisters, and you'll see that and you'll see there's another one that's phrased slightly different to this. So this first question, it says, do you have a right to be informed of gene discovery and research with a brother or sister that causes a serious condition? So almost everybody said, yes, my brother or sister needs to tell me if they've got something bad. I'll come back to the surprises and inconsistencies. And so this next slide asks the question a little bit differently. So it said, if genetic research results discovered in their child showed an increased risk of serious health impacts for extended family or relatives, what should occur? So first, most people said no. Most people said that results should be shared. So very few said absolutely no. But they did want to have more control over exactly who in their family got that information. So they wanted everything from their brothers and sisters, but they didn't necessarily want to give everything back to them. So that's something that we need to pay attention to as we talk about consent. The other surprising thing, to me at least, and I think to researchers, is that we recognize that the quality assurance, and we do pride ourselves on doing things in a proper way in the lab and having the samples labeled and all that sort of thing, but we know that research labs do not have the same quality assurance requirements that clinical labs have. And so we asked the question of participants, and this gets to the question of how reliable is the information that researchers pass on to you? Can I actually use that information in my own health care? And so for researchers are really worried that people are going to take this information and start to use it clinically when we don't have everything that we should have in place to prevent errors and mix-up and so on. So we first asked these three scenarios. A research lab is more reliable than a clinical lab. 47% said yes. So that researchers have this cachet that they're a bit better than the clinical lab. That they're equal, about half. Very few that recognize that researchers' lab probably are not as good as a clinical lab in providing research. So we really have to pay attention to this if we're providing research results back to participants, that their belief in the strength of the findings is going to be very strong based on it's been researched. Another question that we asked, I didn't show you this for the researchers, but we asked the same question for researchers, whether genetic counseling should be provided before or after. But the one little surprising finding to me was that 20% of our respondents indicated that they didn't know what genetic counseling meant. And I was really surprised for that. And so I think as we go forward in terms of research studies and talking to them about research counselors, we should be aware of that potential limitation of the benefit of them. Parallel with this project of doing a quantitative questionnaire, the Forge group did focus group interviews in Montreal and Ottawa, and we shared our results all the way through the projects to try to fill in gaps for both our questionnaire and their questionnaire. And I just want to quote from one of their interviews. This paper is under review at the present time, but this quote I think is very telling from the participant perspective. I think it's irresponsible to not divulge information if you knew. You may cause worry, but at least you're aware of it and can take steps to either mitigate it or do something about it. And I think that really captures what participants think about the return of these results. Lastly, I just show you 3 slides from individuals in the context of Forge, Ignite, and CPC-GC who had received genetic research results back. And there were over 100 of them. And we asked them first if they understood the results that they received. And as you see, about half fully understood them, 54 partially, and 5 not at all. We asked if they'd had any assistance in understanding them. The majority said that they did not, that they'd received them back from the researcher, but not with the benefit of genetic counseling. And then we also asked the question is, if you've received and accepted those results back, would you choose to do so again? And so that tries to get at the question of, is there something that you say yes, but then really no, I don't think I should have done so. And perhaps comfortingly, very few would say no. So a summary from the participants' perspective is that they feel a very strong right to both, again, the target and incidental findings. In contrast to researchers, participants really feel they have a right to uncertain results as well. The researchers feel that uncertain results really should stay to the side. Participants feel less of a need for genetic counselors. However, they have a substantial fraction report that they don't really understand the results. And so I think we need to work towards methods that will help participants understand what they get back. And in terms of method to provide results, confidential web access may help to address some of the concerns about logistics. So in conclusion, I think from these 2 studies and from what's in the literature, we really want to pay attention to clear consent discussions about what will happen with the research information before the patients enroll. We're able to do that now. We are challenged, for sure, with biobank samples that don't have that consent contemplated. And so we are in this period now where we have some very rich biobanks that we've never contemplated the power of the genome-wide screening that we can do now. And so that's going to have to work its way through the system. But I think going forward, we will have a way of talking to participants and families about what the potential implications are, what kind of information we will share, what kind of information we will not share. I think policy needs to be more nuanced than it is. There are this broad statement in the Tri-Council policies that you must return significant individual results, whether it's medical, psychosocial, or social. That's just too broad for researchers to be able to apply in practical senses. And so I think this paper by Green, while it's controversial in laying out those 56 particular mutations, I think it's a start, that we have to start somewhere. And it may turn out that that list expands over time. It may also contract, that we find that those pieces of information turn out not to be what we want to do. In fact, from a genetic counseling standpoint, this perhaps is naive from my standpoint, but to me, that list is actually very helpful because if you look at it, it categorizes just into 4 conditions. It's risk for cancer, risk for heart disease, both cardiomyopathy and arrhythmias, and risk for an anesthetic complication. It makes it a bit easier to talk about risk when you're talking to your participants about what you might receive back from it. It's not that you're talking about these neurodegenerative conditions, and so on. You have really more defined opportunity to think about things. And I think there's many questions to be unanswered as we move forward. There's lots especially in the last 3 years, lots of people have written about this. The literature is really, if you look at, it's one of those, like the reverse of the genome-wide screening in terms of cost, it's just gone up like this in terms of publications. But very little to this point has been from an empiric standpoint. It's mostly expert opinion for what that's worth. And so I think we have lots of opportunity to explore what happens when we start to return research results, how far we should go, do we provide information back to relatives, what happens after the individual's dead. All of that remains to be explored from an empiric standpoint. I want to finish by acknowledging the collaborators for this project, especially Martha Knoppers and Denise Avard, who are in Montreal in the Forge group, of course the parents and the research participants, and then these individuals named here were all very instrumental in helping the projects get up and running in the various sites that participated with this. And then also Hans Yu and Paul Manette at Health Canada, and the expert reviewers here from the IGNITE team. And then this work couldn't have been done without a huge amount of sponsorship. This is primarily Genome Canada and CIHR funded, but there are many co-funders that are listed on this slide that helped with the funding for this project. Thank you for your attention.
Defining a sibling in the first place doesn't necessarily mean that I don't know, do siblings generally have access to my health records if they wanted to go in and find out, look on my health chart for other tests that I might have had done?
No, they don't.
And we make such an effort to keep things confidential and to have things anonymized. It's very, very surprising to me that it can even be discussed, to be disclosed in my interview. It's one thing to say my sibling has an obligation to disclose that to me, that they have an ethical or moral obligation. But as a researcher, to even consider the idea of disclosing information to somebody outside of the participant themselves is very, very surprising to me that it's not.
It's not standard medical practice.
No.
We don't
No.
do that in genetics, and it's against the law, actually.
Right.
I would imagine.
Right.
So it makes it even more surprising.
Yeah.
Because we don't do that.
We don't do it from a clinical sense, and we don't do it from a privacy standpoint. But I think that people,
Adopted families and
family structures are very complex, and you really have to absolutely rely as best you can on the participant in reporting who their siblings are. They may not do so at all. They may not actually know who their siblings are. But I think it talks about the tension that researchers feel that they have potentially life-saving information that's in their hands, and what do you do with that? And if you don't share that and someone suffers from it, then I think we feel intrinsically that we're not doing the right thing. And I think that's what that's expressing. How to actually operationalize that, I think realistically it has to go through the participant initially. You can't just, but it does also speak to anticipating, for example, pancreatic cancer research, you can predict that everybody's going to be dead in a year almost all the time. And so you're going to have this information that is going to be relevant to their family potentially. There's some well-known associated pancreatic cancer genes that either inherited risk for those individuals or melanoma risk that turns out that a melanoma gene is in a pancreas. So that's a piece of information that is potentially life-saving. You don't want it to die with that individual.
But if I had an infectious disease, for example, and I'm told that, do clinicians then disclose to everybody else in the family that person has that an infectious disease, or is that my obligation?
Depends on what the disease is. So some of them, yes. Some are reportable public health wise, and public health takes on the responsibility then to report it to the rest of the family. And there's a whole long list of those things that there are situations where that may occur, and it may occur over the objection of the participant.
And I think that also that question speaks to the issue of genetic counseling, because in clinical terms, when we do get mutation results on a family member, we have our genetic counseling to help facilitate that with the family, and we make efforts to give them letters and communications and give them a clear direction for that affected person. But I don't know in all this genetic research if that's also provided in that regard, so that also may be an issue.
So I think that's, people are just starting to confront that in terms of how do we support participants in providing research information back. And especially worrisome to me is this view that research labs are more reliable than clinical labs.
It's a disaster.
It's an absolute disaster. And so part of that education process is that the findings of the research lab first need to be replicated in the clinical lab for that participant before one even considers going on to family members. At helping to support participants, conveying that information, conveying often negative information to relatives is going to be really important as we move forward, and then making sure that it's done in a clinically certified lab, ultimately I think is also really critical. It is challenging for the novel genes. They may not always be available immediately, and so that is another hurdle that we will need to overcome.
A quick question on the issue of timing, how time sensitivity. I mean, some projects go too long before you provide a summary to the lab. And the researchers, if they decide to apply for a patent or something and hang on before disclosing information, is that patients are protected? Is there any regulations? Or how? I know incidental finding, I think you may have to, it is time sensitive, I don't think you can wait end of study, it's a long term.
It's a good question, and it's not been addressed in any regulations that I'm aware of that the researcher has an obligation to provide information immediately. But I agree with you, there could well be projects that go on for years and years before you are confident that the gene that you're examining is the one that's responsible. But that also, I think, speaks to the clinical utility of this. So if the gene is, you're still not so certain that it's useful, then that probably, from a research perspective anyway, isn't something that we'd want to convey back to participants. Participants want it, but from a research perspective, probably not.
But on the other hand, we have examples where we're pretty sure, but not very sure, certainly can't offer clinical testing, but it does have an impact on people making decisions about organ donation, and that would have an immediate effect if we were to say, we really don't think you should donate organs.
Or we really don't think you should have more children, or whatever the. So I didn't even bring up the reproductive implications, but there are clearly reproductive implications, and where do you draw the line in terms of clinical utility? So you could define clinical utility in a whole bunch of ways. Do I take medicine? Do I live a healthier lifestyle? But it also might be, do I have children who might be affected with this condition?
And I think also what I noticed when I haven't read those ACMG guidelines yet, I've been meaning to, but and a lot of the conditions they're talking about are conditions I see in clinic. So they're sudden death, actionable, sudden death preventable, you wouldn't have a symptom before type of things generally. So I think that's great. But it kind of reminds me of my work in newborn screening, where we started off with doing all the conditions that if we got them early, we treat them, we prevent serious disease that, you can't tell. And what I'm noticing in that area is that it's sort of leaking into, we're going to do it because we don't know a lot about that disease, and then we might learn more.
Right.
Or it might be good for the parents' reproductive decision making instead of like what was originally the plan, like preventing that individual. So just watch out for there's going to be lots of opinions on that, and it may start leaking into these sort of more vague indications as time goes on.
So Robert Green, who was the lead author on this paper, also did a separate paper in Genetics and Medicine that was published about a year ago, and he went to one of the genetics conferences, I don't remember which one, but he gathered 60 geneticists and asked them to rank on a scale, absolutely must return these results back to participants, maybe, and definitely not. And I think there were 80 conditions, And even the people who do this all the time, think about it all the time, there is agreement in only about 75% of the conditions. So that you're right, there will be this leakage, that there's the potential for expanding this without being really careful about how we define the thresholds. And that's in part why I think the regulations need to be better defined, to say exactly what is meant by serious, what is actionable. That the way that's worded now is not sufficient to guide anybody as to how we move forward. And the TCPS recognizes that they've talked on a regular basis since this last guidelines been published. The policy analysts I was speaking with indicated that they've talked about it on 3 separate occasions. They are asking for public input in this next year, precisely to try to get this better defined for us. Because this is not going away. It's only going to get more challenging as the genomics techniques become cheaper and easier. You know, it's cheap to do them, but all the analysis and so on is much more expensive, and then all the consequences are astronomical.
So most participants said that if they had to go back, that they would do it again. Do you know if any of those received incidental findings, or if they were all what they were?
Yeah, we don't have that degree of breakdown. Yes.
Just thinking with the direct-to-consumer testing getting so much more prevalent now, particularly in the U.S., I think that if we don't handle this now, and we don't think about, for instance, web-based, obviously most participants are in favor of sort of web-based secure access, and long-term storage and access and updated results, we're just going to totally miss the boat.
Yeah.
23andMe, I can spend $100. I can get my genotyping. I have permanent access to my data that I can do whatever I want with. And when I log into that website, it's continuously updated with what's often really sort of nebulous results, right?
Yes.
My risk for arthritis is somewhere from 3 to 83%.
Or baldness, right?
So I think participants, probably a lot of patients, want to have access to that, even if results are pretty uncertain.
I do really feel strongly we need to get out ahead of this, and we need to do it not just on expert opinion. So I can talk all I want about it, but it needs to be based in empiric research that says both, what do people want to start with, but then when we start doing it, what happens to them? What do these harms that we're worried about as researchers actually occur? Do they not occur? Are there ways that we can do this in a better way? That all will take very dedicated, careful research to move forward with it.
But you also raised the point of the updating, and I think as soon as you start reporting on certain results, the responsibility, or for the responsibility to be limited to the duration of the study is becoming more problematic, because in a way then you would also have a responsibility to update the patient once you reach certainty, either the yes or no or the consequences about the meaning of the results. So reporting certain results is of course much easier and easy to limit by time, like this is your result, this is the certain outcome, but as soon as the outcome is uncertain, it becomes tricky.
So paradoxically, I think this paper from Green is, in the clinical context, is actually going to help researchers a lot, and it's going to help them not because they give them that threshold, but we recognize, because of this quality assurance issue, that we should in fact be replicating the genetic finding that we see in the lab in a clinical context. If we adopt this clinical recommendation in Canada as well, that you're going to look for these findings if you're doing any specific clinical test, then it's going to take it out of the responsibility of the researcher and put it into the clinician who has ordered the replication of the genetic finding. And it is anticipated that that's going to make its way into the medical record, that those findings then will be linked in an ongoing way, that as new information comes that strengthens the conclusions, or if there are new findings, that those are going to come out. So I think it's actually going to help researchers quite a lot. It'll give them a threshold of where they might start, but then because we know that there has to be a clinical replication, that's going to be put into somebody else's court. It's not going to help the genetics counselors, because it's going to be an enormous task, but it will take this out of our worry about our capacity and our ability to properly do it as researchers, where I think it's better situated in the clinical sphere.
It is a clinical responsibility
right.
once it gets that.
Right.